The red mark hit the screen before I even finished reading my own answer back to myself. 0 credit. Bold letters, a small icon of a Sathari eye blinking beside it, which meant the grading was final, and no appeal request would even open. I sat in the third row of the Unified Mathematics Hall on the Academy ring station, my hands still hovering over the console, and I felt every other student in that room turn to look at me. Not because they cared, because a red 0 on a first exam, in front of 40 species from 30 worlds, was the kind of thing that got you talked about for the rest of the term. Instructor Vez stood at the front of the hall on 4 thin legs, his upper limbs folded across a chest plate the color of wet stone. His 4 eyes swiveled toward me one at a time, like separate cameras locking onto the same target. "Ethan," he said, and the translator in my ear turned his clicking into flat, cold English. "Stay after the session." Nobody in that hall breathed for me. A few of the Sierra students, all silver skin and no eyelids, actually leaned forward in their seats, waiting to watch me get taken apart. I had been on this station for 6 weeks. Earth had joined the Confederation 2 years before I was born, and I was one of the first humans ever accepted into the Academy's youth program. Every mistake I made was not just mine. It belonged to my whole species, whether I liked it or not. The exam question had looked simple. Given a closed system with finite resources and an unbounded growth curve, determine the terminal state. Every other student in that room had written the same 3 words: collapse, total collapse. It was Confederation Axiom 7, carved into the wall behind Vezes in 11 alien scripts, taught in every school on every member world for the last 400 years. Unlimited growth against limited resources always ends the same way. Death of the system. No exceptions. I had written something else. Insufficient information. Turn the page. There was no next page. I knew that. I had written it anyway, because the question the way it was written did not match anything I actually knew to be true, and I was not going to lie on an exam just to get a passing grade. When the hall finally emptied, I walked down to the front, past rows of empty seats still warm from 40 different kinds of bodies, and stood in front of a teacher who had been at this academy for 2 centuries before I was born. Vez laid my exam sheet flat on the desk between us. One long claw rested on the words I had written, like he was pinning down something that might still be alive. "There is no next page, human," he said. "The question ends where it ends. You did not know the answer, so you invented a clever sentence instead." "I didn't invent anything," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "I just didn't have enough information to answer it the way it was written, so I told you exactly what I needed." His eyes did something strange then, all 4 of them swiveling to focus on me at the same moment. I had learned in 6 weeks that this meant he was irritated, the alien version of narrowing his eyes. "The terminal state of unbounded growth against finite resources is collapse," he said. "This is not opinion, Ethan. It is not theory. Every species in this confederation has lived through it. My own people, the Cathari, nearly ended ourselves this way 4,000 years ago. The Sierra lost entire colonies to it. This is why the axiom exists. This is why you are required to learn it, instead of guessing." "Then I understand why you all believe it," I said. "But I've got a different answer, not a guess, a different history." "You have a different sample," Vezes said, and it did not sound like a question. It sounded like a teacher daring a student to embarrass himself in front of nobody but the empty room. "I have Earth," I said. I asked him for a stylus, because I didn't trust the translator to carry the shape of what I meant if I only used words. He handed it to me slowly, like he expected me to waste it. I drew a line on the back of my own exam sheet, a curve climbing up fast at first, the way every growing population does in the beginning. Then, instead of the sharp cliff his textbooks were built around, instead of the sudden crash into famine and war and collapse, I drew the curve bending, flattening out on its own, gently, well before it ever hit any wall. "We call it the demographic transition," I said. "It's not one theory from one lab on one continent. It's just what actually happened, on every continent, at different times, without anyone planning it as a whole species. The wealthier and more educated a place got, the more its birth rate slowed down on its own, not from starvation, not from disease sweeping through and killing millions, from people getting educated, from women getting real choices about their own lives. The terminal state of our growth curve wasn't collapse, Instructor. It was a fork in the road, and we're still walking down it. Vez stared at the drawing for a long time, long enough that his mandibles stopped their constant clicking completely, which I would later learn was the closest thing his species had to holding their breath. This contradicts 200 years of my own teaching, he said finally, very quietly. It doesn't contradict it, I said. It's just page 2. You only ever had page 1 before now. He didn't apologize. I don't think his culture has an easy way to do that, and if it does, he never used it on me. Not that day, and not for a long time after. What he did instead mattered more, even if it took me weeks to understand why. He walked to the terminal at the side of the hall and re-entered my score with his own clause. Full credit. Then, without looking back at me, he flagged the answer for review by the Confederation Academic Board, the very body that had written Axiom 7 onto that wall in the first place. They will not listen to a first-year student, he said. They will listen to a citation. Bring me your century of data, Ethan. Properly sourced. Every number checked twice. I will submit it under both our names, and I will personally take you apart if a single figure does not hold. It took me 3 weeks to build it. He fought me on almost every piece, every data set, every method, every gap I couldn't fully explain with confidence. I learned more mathematics in those 3 weeks than I had in the entire term before it, because a 200-year-old teacher was not going to let a 17-year-old boy rewrite Confederation orthodoxy without being able to defend every single line of it under fire. On the day of the review, I stood in a chamber twice the size of the lecture hall, in front of 9 members of the academic board, species I had only ever seen in textbooks before that morning. A Syrah elder, with skin like poured mercury, a pair of bonded trail minds, who spoke in a single overlapping voice, a Kathiri judge older than Vehez himself, whose 4 eyes studied me the way you might study something that had wandered somewhere it did not belong. Vehez stood beside me the entire time, not in front of me, blocking me from view like a shield, beside me, like a colleague. The questions came fast and sharp, the kind meant to break weak arguments apart at the seams. Why hadn't every human society followed the same curve at the same time? Why had a few regions resisted the pattern for decades? What happened to a system if education access was suddenly taken away again? I answered every one, sometimes with numbers I had memorized, sometimes by admitting flatly that we did not have a complete answer yet, and that this itself was part of the honest picture. The Kathari judge leaned forward at the end, all 4 eyes fixed on the drawing I had made weeks before, now displayed 20 times larger on the chamber wall behind me. You are telling us, the judge said slowly, that an entire species can choose its own terminal state, rather than simply arrive at the one dictated by its resources. I'm telling you my species did, I said. Once. So far. I'm not promising anyone else will. I'm just saying the axiom needs a footnote, not a rewrite. There was a long silence in that chamber, the kind that felt heavier with every second it stretched on. Then the judge made a small motion with one claw, and beside me, Vehez let out a breath through his mandibles that sounded almost like relief. The axiom itself still stands today, mostly unchanged, carved into that same wall in that same 11 scripts. Unbounded growth against finite resources usually does end in collapse. My people were not the first species to prove a rule wrong by turning out to be the exception nobody had accounted for, and we will not be the last. But there is a footnote beneath it now, small but permanent, added the week after that hearing. See Terran demographic transition. Some systems do not collapse under their own weight. They choose a different path before they ever reach the wall. Vez still marks my exams harder than anyone else's in his classes. If anything, he grades me tougher now than before, like he is daring me to hand him a second page every single time I sit down to write. I don't mind it anymore. It means he is actually reading every word I give him, instead of only checking it against what he already believed. 6 weeks after that hearing, a new student joined our year. A young Syrah girl named Lyra, sharp-eyed, quiet, clearly brilliant, and clearly terrified of saying anything that might get marked wrong in front of the whole room. During her second week, Vez gave the class a question about resource cycles on a dying moon colony. one with an answer that matched everything in the textbook perfectly. Lyra raised her hand instead of writing it down. "Instructor," she said, "what if the colony changed its own behavior halfway through the cycle? Would the textbook answer still apply?" Wedvez's 4 eyes swiveled toward her, and for just a moment, I saw something in his posture I recognized completely. "Explain your reasoning," he said. "Fully, and do not stop until you have convinced me." I sat back in my seat and watched her start talking, hesitant at first, then faster, then sure of herself in a way she hadn't been a minute before. Somewhere in that room, another rule was about to get its own quiet footnote.